And as you'll quickly discover, I'm a bear of very little brain, and there are so many names and associations that I'll be going through today. So rather than speak off the cuff, I'm going to be working from the text, which I don't like doing, but it's for your sakes. So this evening I shall be talking about a very unusual group of men who seem to defy the standard perception that an artist and a soldier are inherently different people. These were more than a few volunteers who could knock out a competent watercolour or two. Many of them were capable soldiers who also played a significant part in the artistic life of this country. Formed in the 1860s, the Artists' Rifles saw active service during the Boer War and fulfilled a vital role in the First World War. Their descendants are now one of the best-known military units in the world. I don't intend to give an art historical talk, and I'm probably not best qualified to do so anyway. However, I do want to introduce you to an aspect of the lives of a number of leading late 19th and early 20th century artists that is hardly known. In order to give you a bit of context, here are some of the better-known paintings produced by original members of the regiment. And I'm sure you recognize them, but I'll just run through them with you. Top left, And When Did You Last See Your Father, by William Frederic Yeans. Below that, The Scapegoat by William Holman Hunt. And at the bottom left, Ophelia by John Everett Millais. The Last of England by Ford Madox Brown, inspired by Thomas Woolner's departure. Beata Beatrix by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, that's bottom centre. Top right, Choosing by George Frederick Watts, showing his wife Ellen Terry in a brown silk wedding dress designed by Holman Hunt. And finally, The Lady of Shalott by John William Waterhouse. All the men mentioned had served in the Artists' Rifles, and as you will see, many are household names. It wasn't just pictorial art, but three-dimensional art in the form of sculpture and architecture that was produced by men of the regiment. So here we have Oliver Cromwell by Hamo Thornycroft, the late Twin Towers at Wembley Stadium by Maxwell Ayrton, the architect, Tower Bridge by Sir Horace Jones, Admiralty Arch by Sir Aston Webb, Athlete Wrestling with a Python by Frederic Leighton, who was also a painter, The Griffin by Charles Bell Birch, on top of Horace Jones's Temple Bar Memorial. And finally, The Figure of Prince Albert, which was designed by John Henry Foley, who died before completion, and it was finished by Sir Thomas Brock. The latter was a member of the Artists' Rifles. Needless to say, other artistic fields were well represented in the form of photography, cartoons and illustrations, writing and art criticism. And so we have the Punch cartoonist John Leach, the photographer David Wilkie Winfield in this photograph of William Swindon Barber, who was an architect. Both of these were artists. The critic John Ruskin, the actor-manager Sir Johnston Forbes Robertson, apparently he was the finest Hamlet of the Victorian era. Would you believe the poet Algernon Swinburne? And finally, Charlie's Aunt, a farce by the actor and playwright Brandon Thomas. As we know, artists tend to be people of strong principles, with a certain independence and sometimes impulsiveness. What could have led to a group of them getting together to form a military unit? It was clearly something serious. And the following quote, which is almost reminiscent of de Gaulle's attitude to us 100 years later, hints at this. We are a nuisance to Europe. We have our systems and our policy, and their external result is terror and danger to others, and people are therefore justified in voting us a pest. So admitted an embarrassed Foreign Secretary to the British ambassador in Paris, following an unsuccessful attempt on the French Emperor's life in January 1858. It emerged that the would-be assassin, an Italian, Felice Orsini, and most of his fellow conspirators had lived in Britain as refugees while they were organising their plot against Napoleon III. Furthermore, a Birmingham gunsmith had made 6 copies of the bomb to Orsini's careful specification. Britain's willingness to offer sanctuary to the enemies of foreign regimes posed a problem for many in Europe. Although there might have been misgivings about the British, there was genuine concern in this country about the intentions of the French. Napoleon III had come to power following a coup d'etat in 1851, and comparisons were being made between the French standing army of about 400,000 men and the British army of just over 153,000, of which only 42,000 were effective and in Britain. Following lessons learnt during the Crimean War, the prompt French action to replace their wooden warships with ironclad ones, and the concern shown by Queen Victoria about the increased strength of the fortifications at Cherbourg contributed to the general sense of unease. The government authorised Lords Lieutenant to raise volunteer corps in their counties. The main purpose of these corps was to teach the use of the rifle in order to prepare units to operate and to skirmish in open country. A volunteer was liable to be called out in case of actual invasion or of appearance of an enemy in force on the coast, or in case of rebellion arising in either of these emergencies. While under arms, volunteers were subject to military law and were entitled to be billeted and to receive regular army pay. They were not permitted to quit the force during actual military service, and at other times had to give 14 days' notice before being allowed to leave. Members were to be considered effective if they had attended 8 days' drill and exercise in 4 months, or 24 days within a year. While the provision of premises was the responsibility of commanding officers, the volunteers were expected to provide their own arms and equipment. The volunteers were encouraged to place equal emphasis on the social side as well as on military matters. Where a corps was able to provide its own drill hall, there would also be mess facilities and its own social centre. Sports were a big feature, and inter-corps competitions were arranged. As they were largely self-funded, money would be raised by holding dances, bazaars, fêtes, entertainments, theatrical performances, and concerts. And you can imagine that the artist rifles were at a distinct advantage in that way. Among the young men in London who were seized with patriotic emotion by the threat of a French invasion was a student at Carey's School of Art in Bloomsbury, Edward Cunningham Stirling. He was a ward of Thomas Carlyle and had some basic military experience, having served in the Cornish militia. In 1859, he called a meeting of fellow members of his life class with a view to forming a volunteer group to join one of the new volunteer companies which were being created. The results were disappointing. Only 2 decided to join him. However, word got around the artistic community, and in early 1860, a meeting took place at the studio of a well-known portrait painter, Henry Wyndham Phillips, which resulted in 119 members, forming a corps of painters, sculptors, engravers, musicians, architects, poets, and actors. This new unit of 1 company in strength was named the 38th Middlesex Volunteer Rifle Corps (Artists). Towards the end of 1860, its official headquarters was established at Burlington House, the new home of the Royal Academy. Drill was performed in the gardens at the rear of the building from 7 to 9 a.m. and 4 to 7 p.m. Then in 1868, owing to building changes at Burlington House, the corps moved to the Arts Club, which was then in Hanover Square. This is a slightly later image, but shows the artist rifles forming up in the courtyard at Burlington House. There were 2 kinds of membership of the corps: those enrolled for military service, who had to provide their own uniform and equipment, pay an entrance fee of 10 shillings and 6pence, and an annual subscription of 1 guinea. And those honorary members who were under no obligation for military service, but who paid an additional 10 shillings and sixpence entrance fee and an annual subscription of 2 guineas. For the latter, it was more of a social club, although honorary members were always a very small minority. Who then made up this nascent corps? The early enrolment registers show a preponderance of painters, ranging in age from the early 20s to the mid-40s. Many were already showing signs of a successful career. Frederic Leighton was a man of great dynamism and many abilities. Fluent in his teens in French, Italian, and German, and destined originally to be a doctor like his father, he showed early promise as an artist. He trained initially on the continent, firstly in Frankfurt and then in Rome. He mixed happily with Roman high society and with the ever-growing circle of English visitors and expatriates, and he was an accomplished dancer. "I don't know what he's like as a painter," said a girl with whom he danced, "but I know he's the best waltzer in Rome." William Holman Hunt, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, and Thomas Woolner were founding members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. George Frederick Watts had already won a prize for the decoration of the Houses of Parliament in 1843 and was just beginning to come into the public eye. William Morris was on the verge of forming Morris & Co. with fellow volunteers Edward Burne-Jones, Ford Madox Brown, and Rossetti amongst the firm's founders. John Ruskin, an honorary member, was the most influential art critic of his time, as well as being a talented watercolourist. At that meeting in Wyndham Phillips' studio, Frederic Leighton and Alfred Nicholson, a musician, were made ensigns, or second lieutenants as we call it nowadays. At the same time, Millais and Arthur James Lewis were elected lieutenants, and Wyndham Phillips captain. Arthur James Lewis was number 2 on the first enrolment register of the 10th of May 1860. An amateur artist and a haberdasher and silk merchant of the firm of Lewis and Allenby. He was wealthy and very well connected. It was said of him, "No man had a wider acquaintance with artists than he. He was the companion and friend of all the painters of his time." Throughout the 1860s, he held musical evenings at his rooms in Jermyn Street, and later at Murray Lodge, his large house in Kensington. Here, up to 150 like-minded men would gather to discuss the arts, to smoke, and to sing popular songs. The singers were known as the Murray Minstrels and included many others who became members of the Artists' Rifles. John Leach and Charles Keane, the Punch cartoonists, Field Talford, an artist, most of the St. John's Wood clique of artists, and Frederick Walker, who produced many of the invitations, were all keen members. Charles Perugini was also a regular attender. He was to have a successful career as a painter and was an enthusiastic volunteer, being later commissioned into the corps. Other regular attenders, but non-members of the Artists' Rifles, were the composer Arthur Sullivan, the writers Anthony Trollope, Charles Dickens, and Wilkie Collins, the Alice in Wonderland illustrator John Tenniel, and the Punch cartoonist George de Maurier. Edward, Prince of Wales, would also occasionally attend, as would various members of the House of Lords. It would be fair to say that most of London's artistic community either met at these occasions or had contacts with those who did, and that men of the Artists' Rifles were at its centre. When they got together, the billiard table would be boxed over and transformed into a buffet. It was covered with bottles and glasses, pipes and cigars, and mountains of oysters. The amount consumed on one occasion was 278 dozen, or 3,336. The links are interesting. For example, Perugini's wife, Kate, was the daughter of Charles Dickens and the model for the young woman in Millais' famous painting, The Black Brunswicker. Marriage linked other members, as Arthur James Lewis married the actress Kate Terry in 1867, whose sister, the famous Ellen, was briefly married to George Frederick Watts. Valentine, better known as Val Prinsep, was another keen volunteer, eventually being promoted to senior major in the Corps. His parents had leased Little Holland House in Kensington, where they lived next door to G.F. Watts, in a house built by Frederic Pepys Cockerell, both members of the Artists' Rifles. The Princeps made the house a haven for artists and writers, including Thackeray, Tennyson, Browning, Trollope, Edward Burne-Jones, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. It was only the last two who were members of the regiment. Val Prinsep's mother was the sister of pioneering photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, and incidentally the grandmother of Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell. Julia Margaret Cameron, shown here, acknowledged David Wilkie Winfield, a fellow member of the Corps, as the main influence on her work, and she wrote, "To my feeling about his beautiful photography, I owed all my attempts, and indeed consequently all my success." Other early photographers who joined the Corps were the Swede Oscar Rylander, who we've already seen, and the Frenchman Camille Sylvie, both pioneers in the new field. Roger Fenton, whose images of the Crimean War are well known today, was also a member. I show at the bottom one of Julia Margaret Cameron's photographs of the actress Ellen Terry, who, as we've heard already, was briefly married to another member of the Corps, George Frederic Watts. You can see it's like a spider's web, this whole business. Architects were well represented amongst the early members. Robert Edis, who went on to command the Corps in 1883, had been number 8 on the original enrolment register. Influenced by the well-known architect and fellow Artists' Rifle, William Burgess, who had sponsored his membership, he owned his own practice when he joined. By 1864, he was president of the Architectural Association. He specialized in commercial premises and private houses, although the great Central Hotel at Marylebone, which is now the Landmark Hotel, was one of his better-known commissions. William Burgess sought to escape from both 19th century industrialization and the neoclassical architectural style and re-establish the architectural and social values of utopian medieval England. Here is his banqueting hall at Cardiff Castle. Frederic Pepys Cockerell, who has already been mentioned, was another original architect member. He was the son of Charles Cockerell, the architect, archaeologist, and writer. Perhaps he's most remembered for the Carlisle Memorial Column at Castle Howard. Horace Jones, another member of the artists, went on to design Tower Bridge and the markets of Billingsgate, Smithfield, and Leadenhall, amongst many other London sites. Here's a photograph of the latter. George Devey was discovered by the Rothschild family and was to be kept in full employment for the rest of his career, carrying out much work at their houses at Mentmore and Tring. Here is one of his lodges at Mentmore. The Artists' Rifles volunteers had a reputation for being smart and efficient. They were also well connected, as you've heard. In the early days especially, celebrated as some of the artists were, some of them were frankly of little military value. William Morris, for instance, seems to have been always having problems telling his right from his left during close order drill, invariably begging pardon of the comrade whom he found himself facing. If you think in terms of Corporal Jones in Dad's Army, you'll get the idea. Although some quickly lost interest, others were very keen. And amongst these, for instance, were Frederic Leighton, Robert Edis, G.F. Watts, shown arrowed here, William Morris, Charles Perugini, Val Prinsep, Carl Haag, David Wilkie Winfield, Frederick Walker, John Hodgson, and William Richmond. These were some of the better-known artists who continued to be members long after any threat to national security had passed. The painter James Whistler, who wasn't a member, famously described the then Sir Frederic Leighton, the commanding officer of the Artists' Rifles, as, quote, "the Colonel of the Royal Academy and the President of the Artists' Rifles. Aye, and he paints a little." As you'll also notice, many seem to have had a passion for dressing up, whether off-duty or on exercise. I know that there were at least one painter and 3 architects here, One of the latter also became curator of the Soane Museum. However, I need to do more research on the two others shown. I do know that Captain Ramsey, the adjutant, was a regular army officer. Of course, some might have joined for all the wrong reasons, as shown by John Leach, another member of the Artists' Rifles, in Punch. The caption here reads, "That distinguished rifle shot, Mr. Punch, having done his duty like a man, throws himself under the mistletoe and receives his just reward." Nothing changes. However, a few exercises like this tended to weed out those who weren't serious. This is by Charles Keane, another volunteer and another Punch cartoonist. It was no wonder that Edward Burne-Jones's wife remembered him at the time as a very tired man in a grey uniform. Nearly 40 years later, they were still at it. And 50 years later, they were still marching. In this case, the distance from their headquarters in Euston to Portsmouth was nearly 75 miles, undertaken over a long weekend. And any of those with a military background here might look at his boots, which I've arrowed, and wonder how on earth they did it. The regiment had very strong links with the Royal Academy from their earliest days. For the first 8 years, the headquarters of the regiment was at Burlington House. Many of the volunteers were also associated with the Royal Academy. As you see, 5 members were elected President of the Royal Academy. At least 41 were elected Royal Academicians, and 8 became associates. Of these, a number were senior RAs, keepers, librarians, professors of painting, and masters of the sculpture school. Many others trained at the Royal Academy schools. This figure is growing as I work my way through the enrolment registers. Parades such as this took place in the forecourt until the 1980s, and this was one of the last. The significance of this image will be clear towards the end of my talk. In fact, the Artists' Rifles War Memorial is located to the right of the main entrance of the Royal Academy. It was designed by Geoffrey Webb, a stained glass artist who served in the Artists from 1901 to 1904. A wreath is laid here every year by ex-members of the serving regiment. These are the 5 members of the Artists' Rifles who were elected as presidents of the Royal Academy: Frederic Leighton, John Millay, Edward Poynter, Aston Webb, and Frank Dixie, all of whom were knighted. However, over the years, the composition of the corps broadened. By 1893, painters and sculptors represented less than 5% of the membership, with architects 12%, lawyers 12%, doctors 10%, and civil engineers 6%. The city and, quote, miscellaneous occupations made up the remaining 55%. The unwritten rule seems to be that each candidate should be of, quote, good social backgrounds and education, or a gentleman in the broadest possible accepted sense of the term. The corps was essentially a middle-class phenomenon, relying heavily on the public schools and universities for recruits. Unlike most of the other units, its demographic remained essentially the same throughout its existence. The tradition of all officers serving in the ranks before being commissioned, even if joining from other regiments or indeed from the regular army, was one that continued until recently. The first phase, if one can put it like that, ended at about the time of Frederic Leighton's funeral in 1896, where the Artists' Rifles played a major part. Here you can see them formed up in front of Burlington House and also lining the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. Edward Burne-Jones was to die 2 years later. A few later well-known works, or by artists that might be recognised, and the years in which they served in the regiment are these. Top left, John Dolman, a very gallant gentleman. Below that, Sidney Paget, who illustrated the Sherlock Holmes stories in the Strand magazine. George William Joy, The Death of General Gordon. Ernest Ibbotson, in this case, The Royal Fusiliers. He's an almost forgotten artist who captured the spirit of the British Army in many illustrations like this. Godfrey Merry, this is the Artists' Rifles in Camp, 1884. It's now in the National Army Museum. And Jack Yeats, he sings to the night. And he was the brother of the poet W.B. Yeats. An analysis of the early enrolment registers produces all kinds of surprises. I discovered, for example, that the cabmen's shelters in London were designed by a German-born architect who joined the Artist Rifles as a 20-year-old and who served for 30 years. At one time, there were 60 of these shelters in London, but now there are just 13. Most of these are Grade 2 listed, so they're likely to survive. However, further delving often comes up with the occasional unwelcome surprise. I suppose that this is inevitable, considering the many thousands of men who served, some 22,000 by the end of the First World War. It was known that Michael Maybrick was an eminent composer and singer who took part in a number of London concerts and operas. He also wrote sentimental and sacred songs under the name Stephen Adams. Maybrick was a keen cricketer, yachtsman, and cyclist. He was a magistrate, a Freemason, and 5 times Mayor of Ryde on the Isle of Wight. Maybrick had joined the Artist Rifles in 1886 and served for 6 years, being promoted to captain by the time he left in 1892. In 1889, he organised the music for the opening of their new headquarters in Euston. So far, so good. And in many ways, Maybrick was a typical artist. However, there are increasing suggestions that he may also have been Jack the Ripper. A couple of books have been written that make a quite compelling argument to support this idea. Moving swiftly on. Sports continued to play a major part of their activities, with bayonet fighting, as shown here, being one of the sports that they excelled at. The regiment was to win the championship at the Royal Tournament for many years. The Artist Rifles first saw active service in South Africa during the Second Boer War. The regiment provided volunteers for a mixed unit that was called the City of London Imperial Volunteers. To demonstrate London's contribution to the South African War, the Lord Mayor had proposed to put in the field a regiment of 1,000 men drawn from volunteers from the London battalions of the Volunteer Force. The complement was later increased to 1,400 men. No battalion would provide more than 20 men, and all costs would be met by the City Corporation, the City Guilds, and by public subscription. However, having said that, the Artist Rifles provided 58 men to the CIV, and a further 200 transferred to other regiments where many of them served as officers. So the Artist Rifles formed the basis, basically, of the City of London Volunteers. This was to set the scene for future years. At 13:30 hours on Sunday, the 2nd of August, 1914, the Artist Rifles arrived at Perham Down on Salisbury Plain for their annual camp. At midnight on the same day, they were recalled to London post-haste, and on the 5th of August, were mobilised for active service. The enrolment register of that time shows that 50 new men signed up to the artists on the day that war was declared, and 121 on the 5th of August, the following day. So well rehearsed in mobilisation procedures was the regiment that all but one member of the battalion had reported for duty by the evening of the 5th, and the missing man sent a telegram from abroad the next day saying that he was returning immediately. Initially, they occupied 2 North London schools, and then they were stationed briefly at the Tower of London. By the end of that month, 5,000 recruits had applied for admission into the Artist Rifles. Of these, 570 were accepted, and those who were unsuccessful in joining the HAC, the London Scottish, or other London territorial units formed the nucleus of the Royal Fusilier and other public school battalions. As a foretaste of what was to come, I note that the owner of this kit bag, Eric William Tiddy, was to be later commissioned into the Gloucestershire Regiment, with whom he was awarded the Military Cross for bravery. Following a few weeks carrying out special duties in London, which included guarding German internees at Olympia and training near Watford, they embarked on the 26th of October and sailed for France on the SS Osterlind. While on its way up to Ypres, the 1st Battalion was halted at Bailleul by a staff officer with an urgent message from Sir John French, the Commander-in-Chief, who wished to see them. The result of an historic interview between him and the commanding officer, Colonel May, was that a few days later, some 50 privates and a few corporals of the regiment were commissioned on the spot and sent off to reinforce other regiments, taking command of platoons of seasoned regular soldiers of the 7th Division. The experiment proved so successful that a further batch was called for and orders issued that the battalion was to be transformed into an officer training corps. The quality of the men was such that by the end of the war, 32 of the original 700 artists who embarked for France in October 1914 had become commanding officers of frontline infantry regiments. Of the 1,000 men who'd been trained by the regiment, over 1,000 men who'd been trained by the regiment were awarded medals for gallantry. Following the war, Earl French, as he had become, said, and I quote, "I shall never forget the first visit I paid to the artists after they landed in France, or the wonderful impression they left on my mind of the possibilities which were in that corps of furnishing a want which was so terrible to all of us at the time, the supply of officers. What really influenced me in trying the experiments I had to try was the appreciation I had of the splendid material of which I saw you were composed." The regiment did see action as a formed unit, and in this famous painting by John Nash, who joined the Artists' Rifles with his brother Paul, shows one such battle. Of the 80 men who took part at Welsh Ridge, 68 were killed or wounded during the first few minutes. Nash was one of the 12 spared by the shell fire, and he painted this picture 3 months later. He later presented a second version to the regiment, which we still have. And Nash, if you look, he's the corporal, the second standing figure from the right. He painted himself into it. Even better known is this iconic image from the First World War, designed and drawn by Alfred Leighton, another member of the regiment. Here he is with some colleagues in 1915. It'll be noticed that even at this stage, the Artists' Rifles was still the natural destination of practicing artists, even when conscripted. Their creativity continued in the front line. Amongst other skills, the regiment provided 3 Chinese linguists for the Chinese Labour Corps, 20 accountants, and 7 electrical engineers for GHQ. In September 1915, 3 men were sent for special duties with the gas experts during the first British gas attack at Loos. The Wipers Times is often thought to be the original trench magazine that was first issued in February 1916. However, the Artists' Rifles' Dixie Scrapings was published in early 1915. This quote from the founder of the Machine Gun Corps expresses well the skills contained within the ranks of the Artists' Rifles. One must remember that we're talking about soldiers here as well as officers. And the quote reads as follows: "Yet again, the artists were summoned to my aid, and a skilled shorthand writer and typist appeared at the school with typewriting machine complete. I often wonder whether the regiment would have been able to supply a deep-sea diver or a Hooghly pilot. In their ranks were to be found lawyers, musicians, opera singers, painters, architects, music hall artists, doctors, stockbrokers, clergymen. One of these was a sergeant instructor later and held regular services on Sunday morning in the prescribed costume, engineers, chemists, etc., etc. In order to give you an idea of some other artistic men who served with the Artists' Rifles during the First World War, I show you these. Wilfred Owen, he served from 1915 to 1916 and was commissioned into the Manchester Regiment. He won a military cross in 1918 and was killed shortly after. Tom Purvis, the poster artist, he was known in the 1920s and 30s as the King of the Hoardings. The sculptor Frank Dobson, here is his sculpted head of Sir Osbert Sitwell. Cyril Kenneth Bird, better known by his pseudonym Fougas, produced many World War II propaganda posters. He was also editor of Punch. The Royal Artillery Memorial by Charles Sergeant Jagger, MC. Paul Nash, the Surrealist painter and brother of John Nash, and here is his Totes Mir, which is in the Tate. Some other well-known artists are Noel Coward, although he served for 8 months only before being medically discharged. Sir Herbert Gunn, this is his conversation piece at the Royal Lodge, Windsor, of 1950. The sixpence and many other coins were designed by George Kruger Gray. The silversmith, Alwyn Carr, is best known from his association with Omar Ramsden. Their silverware is now highly prized. Robert Sheriff's Journey's End was based on his experiences as a captain in World War I. Eric Blore, the character actor, is seen here with Fred Astaire in Top Hat. Clive Brook acted beside Marlene Dietrich in Shanghai Express. And Barnes Wallis, he was not an artist, but a scientist, engineer, and an inventor. He's best known for inventing the bouncing bomb, and he attended reunions until his death in the late 1970s. Further works that might be recognised by members of the Artists' Rifles were Dr. Dolittle by Hugh Lofting, Meredith Frampton's portrait of Sir Edwin Lutyens, John Miller Watts's pop cartoons, William Macmillan's East Fountain in Trafalgar Square. He also designed the British War Medal and Victory Medal, Vincent Harris's MOD building in Whitehall, Frank Innes's Elfin Oak in Kensington Gardens, and The Quest for Corvo by the biographer and epicure A.J.A. Symonds, who was co-founder of the Wine and Food Society in 1953. Now, I'm going to stop here because we're going to have our break, and then I'm going to talk briefly about the later stages. Does that fit in, Mark?
Thank you, Patrick. We're good.
Right, moving on. I've tried to try and get a few Streatham connections. And I discovered, well, I see here from this very good display, that 2 of our Victoria Cross winners had associations with Streatham. And so you see here Geoffrey Cather, first of all, who was born in Christchurch Road, Streatham Hill. He served in the regiment before the First World War, and then obviously rejoined. He didn't rejoin the Artists' Rifles, but I don't know who he joined come the First World War, come 1914, but he was then commissioned into the Royal Irish Fusiliers, and it was with the RAF that he won his Victoria Cross posthumously in 1916. And Arthur Fleming Sands, who was born at Northstead Road, Tulse Hill, he signed up the day after war was declared on the 5th of August 1914, and after training with the Artists' Rifles, who, if you remember, we were by that stage an officer-producing regiment, was commissioned into the East Surrey Regiment, and it was with the East Surreys that he won his Victoria Cross in 1915. So that's 2 of our 8 Victoria Crosses. And then a few names here. What I've been doing, I won't say it's a tedious project, but it is massively a massive project. I have been going through with a couple of volunteers, part-time volunteers, the 6 volumes of our enrolment registers. So from the 10th of May 1860 to the end of the First World War, really the beginning of 1919, all the names, addresses, ages, the dates of enlistment, the companies they joined, height, and also sometimes, not always, the occupations, religion and marital status are all recorded. And I've been transcribing these things. I've got to volume 6, and I'm up to about 1917. Although I've cheated a bit, I've been putting the names in and some of the addresses, but at some stage I then got to go back to the beginning and start feeding in all these addresses. But all kinds of information is coming out. There are people emerging that I had no idea were in the regiment, all sorts of excitements and peculiarities, rather like Maximilian Clark, that German architect, young German, who created those cabmen's shelters, for example. He served for 30 years. And so these are some names, only one of which actually means anything to me. But some of these, and this is the first slide of 2, might mean something to you. The earliest that I can see, although the address isn't at all clear, although I could see Streatham, is George Bradbury. And then intriguingly, we obviously had a drum and fife band, and so there are a large number of boys and youths, so chaps from about 16 to 18, joining from St Leonard's School in Streatham. I've got a list of names, I didn't bother putting them on here. So 2 batches of them. And then 1900, I mean, there would have been men between 1879 and 1900, but I just haven't transcribed those addresses. A number of other names. One interesting one for me is that Edgar James Keeley, I knew his work anyway, and I just put, he was a poster artist, I put one of his recruiting posters up there. So he lived at 35 Tierney Road on Streatham Hill. I'm afraid, not being a local, none of these addresses mean anything to me, nor the names, apart from Keeley. And here are some more names, lots more names. Some of you might even live either in the same house or in the same roads as some of these chaps. There will probably be hundreds of young men who came from Streatham, and eventually, when I complete this project, I'll be able to search by borough, by street name, by all sorts of things. So that's a project that we've been doing. So in 1937, the regiment again became an officer-producing unit for the Territorial Army, and it trained officers during the early days of the Second World War. Although the artistic element was not as great during the war as during the First War, some notable members were these: Desmond Llewellyn, who played Q in the James Bond films; Michael Goodliffe, who appeared in many films from the 1950s to the 1970s, including Von Ryan's Express in 1965, The 39 Steps in 1959, and Peeping Tom in 1960. Robert Sheriffs, who worked for Punch and the Radio Times. Peter Hicks, a sculptor and silversmith. I can't pretend that I knew of Peter Hicks before all of this. Howard Marion Crawford, best known for his portrayal of Dr. Watson in the 1954 television adaptation of Sherlock Holmes. However, the regiment was soon put into suspended animation until 1947, when it was reconstituted as 21st Special Air Service Regiment, brackets Artists Rifles. Many of its new members had fought with David Stirling's wartime SAS, with the SBS, the Special Boats Squadron, and also SOE. Initially, it wore the Mars and Minerva cap badge, as you see here, but this was later changed to the more familiar one at the top. The parachute wings worn on the left breast indicate that this man in the photograph had served with either the SAS or SBS and had taken part in several operations. The award was more highly prized than a medal within the regiment. It's hard to believe that there could be a connection between the students of a life class in the late 1850s with the present military unit, but they had a lot in common. Their 3 shared strengths were independence, irregularity, intelligence, and efficiency. So I'll end on that quote. And I hope that this has opened a few eyes and demonstrates to you that soldiers are not necessarily as two-dimensional as some would have you believe. And if you wish to learn more, you might be interested in these social media sites. And that is the end of my talk, and I'm very happy, if time permits, and if I'm allowed to answer questions if you have any. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Patrick. That was absolutely amazing.